hablamos sobre el subjuntivo otra vez con cláusulas adjetivas. So, aquí tenemos número 6, el subjuntivo con cláusulas adjetivas. So, aquí tenemos dos frases. Yo quiero una casa cómoda and yo quiero una casa que sea cómoda, right? At the end, it's the same thing. It's this comfy house, but we've said it in two different ways. So, up above, we have una casa cómoda. A house is a thing, right? So, it's a noun. And then that whole thing is a noun phrase. Down here, we have also una casa, and that also is a noun. But we have una casa is embedded in a bigger clause, right? Do you remember what makes a clause from your English classes? We have independent, we have dependent clauses. This is actually a dependent clause. But what actually do you need to have a clause? A subject and a conjugated verb, right? So our subject is understood, or is a casa, but here's our conjugated verb. The verb ser that's conjugated in the subjuntivo. All right, so, cómoda. It describes house. So what kind of word is it?
Adjective.
Adjectivo. All right. Que sea cómoda is a clause
Which is comfy.
which is functioning as a
Dependent.
adjective also. Right? It also is dependent. So, que sea cómoda, it has the same function as cómoda, but sometimes we're going to have to use a verb to describe something instead of a noun. Like, it would have been a lot easier here just to say cómoda and not que sea cómoda. But maybe you want to say, I want a cook who flips flapjacks faster than anybody else, right? And flipping flapjacks, there's not an adjective that is a flapjack flipper, right? So sometimes you're actually going to have to use the verb to describe things instead of just using the adjective. Ahora, the nucleus of the adjective clause is the important part. A nucleus, you don't have all of them on your note taker, you're going to need to add some stuff. So the nucleus of the adjective clause, it has a fancy grammar word. In your grammar classes, it should actually be called an antecedent. But grammar words scare people, so I call it a nucleus. Which kind of scares science people, but whatever, you know what it means, right? Kind of the center, the important part, the brain of it. So the nucleus of the adjective is the direct object of the first verb and the subject of the second verb. What? So if we go back a slide, what was our nucleus?
Can you say that again?
I can say that again. What was our nucleus in this one? A casa, right? Okay? It's the important part of that adjective clause. So it's the direct object of the first verb and the subject of the second verb. So when we find our direct objects, remember you take the verb and you ask what? All right. Or whom. Or who. Whom, because it's an object. So, I need a dog who doesn't bark. The verb is need. So you need what?
Dog.
Need a dog. So the dog is a direct object of the verb need. But that second verb is bark. Who barks?
Dog.
The dog barks. So the dog is the subject of the verb barks. So the dog all at once is the direct object of need and the subject of bark. It's 2 in 1. Right? It's the antecedent, right? But you can also see it's the nucleus of the who doesn't bark, right? The nucleus of the adjective clause. So it's the noun that's modified by the adjective clause. So all these things are fancy ways to try to figure it out, but I think it's almost always obvious what the thing you're describing is, really. That's all we need to know is what thing you're describing. Well, looking at that thing we're describing, that nucleus antecedent word, the dog, basically, is going to help us to decide what tense to put bark in. Okay? So we need to look at this, the tense, the bark verb, that's that verb that's in the adjective clause. All right, so there's 2 types of adjective clauses because there are 2 types of those nucleuses of that, 2 types of dogs. So, if the nucleus is not specific, if the nucleus is imaginary, or if it may not exist, or we flat out say it does not exist, then the second verb, bark, for example, is going to be subjunctive. Okay, so if it doesn't exist, if it might not exist, if it's imaginary, or if it's just a generalization, if it's not a specific thing, then you're going to use subjunctive. So for example, I live in an apartment. I need a dog who doesn't bark, right? I'm not actually supposed to have a dog, but I figure if I get a dog that doesn't make a lot of noise, nobody will know, right? So I need a dog who doesn't bark. What do I need? A dog who doesn't bark? The dog, right? So the dog is the important word here. And I have to decide, does that dog, is it a specific dog? No. Is it imaginary? Probably. I'm just imagining this doggy in my head running through my house, living life with me. And it certainly doesn't exist just yet. So any dog that doesn't bark, excellent. So bark in this case would be subjunctive. Okay? However, when we have a specific thing in mind, that second verb is going to be indicative. Okay? So if it is specific, if it exists and we know it exists, then we can point to it. We're going to use indicative. For example, I need the dog who doesn't bark. I've already been to the pound. I walk in, and there's a Basenji. Basenji is this Egyptian breed of dogs that don't bark. They're barkless. They can't bark. I walk in, I need a dog who doesn't bark, subjunctive, and I see a Basenji, and I'm like, yes, this is my lucky day. And I tell the pound lady, I want the dog that doesn't bark. I forgot the name Basenji, or I would have said I want the Basenji, right? But that's kind of a weird word to say. So instead, I'm going to say, Senor pound guy, I want the dog who doesn't bark. He knows I'm talking about a specific dog because I used ladra, indicative, and not ladre, subjunctive. Clues. So sometimes you're trying to figure out, when it's your life, you're going to know if you need any dog or you need one specific dog, right? But when you're doing worksheets and when you're kind of figuring out somebody else's things, here's some things you could look so. So you're going to use subjunctive if you're generalizing your wants, right? If you're just kind of saying, yeah, in general, this is kind of what I need. You're going to use subjunctive if anyone or anything that fits the bill, right? Any pastry that has frosting on it is going to work. Or any pastry that's chocolate, right? Any chocolate. So I don't care if it's a chocolate cupcake, if it's chocolate buñuelo, if it's chocolate whatever. If it's chocolate, it's going to work. If the perfect thing might not even exist, right? The perfect man. Who knows? Does he exist? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe he's sitting right next to you.
I know, I'm pretty perfect.
You are good. You are good. Now, if you don't have any clues, right? There's no context clue whatsoever. You don't know the situation. It's just this random sentence. In that case, look for a versus the. So un, uno, unas, and unos is a clue that you're a, so any versus the, right? But that doesn't always work. So it does work like, I want a carpenter who is cheap. Right? I don't have any situation, you don't know the context, but all you hear is a carpenter, so you can pretty much think any carpenter, subjunctive. But sometimes it'll backfire if you only use that. For example, if I said, I have a car that doesn't work. Is it a specific car? Yeah, it's parked in my driveway. So I would use because I said I have. So that sometimes will backfire. Indicative. Things that mean indicative. If you can point to it, right? Like my example in the pound, I could say that dog in cage 3. The cute little one smiling at me. If it has a name, his name's going to be Bobo. Or maybe Carlos. I know, Carlos was cansado, that's why I named him the perro. And if you have no context whatsoever, use the. So el, la, los, and las is a pretty good clue that you're talking about a specific one because it is a definite article. So that's why you used it. So you're probably talking about a specific person or a specific thing. Here are some verbs that are going to set up these kinds of phrases, clauses actually. So here, I want someone who, I'm looking for, I desire a friend that. I need a job that. I'm looking for a class that. I prefer a roommate that, right? All of those things are verbs that are going to set up this kind of situation, okay? You should be able to recognize it because you're looking for adjective clauses. You're looking for clauses that use verbs to describe nouns, right? These are some of the initial verbs that are going to be helpful for you when you're making these kind of sentences. Now, a lot of these verbs we saw in one of our other categories here. Value, reaction, doubt, negation, emotion, ojalá, hope, imposition. A lot of those same verbs showed up in what other category?
Hope. Imposition.
Verbs of imposition. I want you to run. I desire that you run. I need you to study. I prefer that you do it now, right? So some of these things can also set up verbs of imposition, so be careful. Adjective clause versus verbs of imposition. So an adjective clause, wanting an action, wanting someone to do something, is verb of imposition. So then you just need to look for two different subjects. Wanting a thing and using a verb to describe it is an adjective clause. And then you need to decide, does this thing exist or not? Is it a known entity or an unknown one? Wow, sorry. And so I want a friend who listens. Is that an adjective clause or is that a verb of imposition? Adjective clause, because what do you want? A friend, okay? And you're describing them with a verb, listens. But I want you to listen. What's that? Imposition, right? What do you want? The listening, right? I want the action. I want you to do the action. So this second one, you need to say, do I have two subjects? For the first one, you need to look at the friend and decide, is the friend a specific known friend, or is the friend a generalization of friendness? And we need you to study.
Well, that's imposition.
That's imposition, right? Needing the action. We need a student who studies. That is the adjective clause, right? Because what do you need? The student, and you're using studies to describe them.
That's not action because you need to study.
Yeah, they all have action, right? Right? Study, listen, listen. But is your main objective wanting the action done or wanting the thing and describing it with an action?